love that she shared that today because we've been talking about living a life or being invited. Last week we talked about being invited to purpose, to a life of purpose, and that life is all about going and all about giving of yourself and serving others and doing those things. And today we're going to be talking about being invited to significance. One of the things that's always really entertaining to do is to talk with a child and find out what they want to do with their life. Do you know what I mean? How many of you remember what you wanted to be as a kid? Some of you. The rest of you need to take a moment and try to remember what you wanted to be as a kid. Okay, I remember some of mine, it was like I wanted, the typical thing, like I wanted to be an astronaut. But I got a little more specific than that. I wanted to be the first astronaut to make it to Mars. Well, that didn't happen. Praise God it didn't, because they're talking about that being a one-way trip. So I'm all right that God chose something different for me. But you look at a child, and so many times kids have this idea that they want to do something big, right? They want to make a difference. They want to be significant. Now, sometimes in our life, we kind of go through life and we get beat up, don't we? We get knocked around. Some of the dreams that we have get completely shattered. Sometimes they get shattered because of different things that happen in our life. Sometimes they get shattered because of what somebody says to us. Sometimes we just get into the rut of life and we forget that we had a desire to be significant. But we're going to be looking at Mark chapter 6 today. And we're going to look at an invitation that Jesus gave to his disciples. It doesn't quite seem like an invitation, but I guarantee you it was an invitation. And it was this invitation to be a part of something big. Be a part of something huge. And what we're going to do, instead of all of us together reading through the entire passage, we're going to take some time and we'll read a little bit of it, and I'll have it up on the screen for you to follow along, but we'll read a little bit of it and then we'll talk through what's going on, because it's really important that we understand what is being talked about. So Mark chapter 6, starting at verse 30, it gives us a little bit of backdrop, or helps us to remember what happened before. It says, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. So if you remember the last time, Jesus had his disciples go out in groups of 2 and go throughout the land and to go proclaim the gospel and to heal the sick and to cast out demons and all of these things. And the disciples went and they did that, and they come back now excited. Like, they come back and they are charged up. They are ready to go. They can't believe some of the things that God has done in their life. They can't believe how they've been used. And so they're coming back and they are sharing with Jesus everything that they had done. They finally had an opportunity to do what they had been watching Jesus do. See, for so long they felt like they sat on the sidelines, right? For so long they felt like they had just been watching Jesus minister, and all of a sudden Jesus had given them the invitation to a life of purpose. And he told them to go. And they did, and they went, and they saw all these things, and now they come back to Jesus. And they begin to tell him all that they've done. And you could just imagine the excitement in the disciples as they come back, because they were finally used by God. And so this was a big deal to them. But then let's just keep going. It says this, and he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now, this is significant. See, sometimes in our desire to do something, in our desire to make a difference, in our desire to change the world, if you will, we forget to do some very key things. We forget to take care of ourselves. I love the fact that right after the disciples come back from doing all of these things, Jesus doesn't send them right back out again and says he invites them to rest. And he says, come with me and let's go to a desolate place and rest. See, Jesus knew something that sometimes we don't like thinking about. We have this feeling, we have this idea that if we stop working, if we stop doing things, if we stop going, if we stop, trying to make a difference, if we take time just for ourselves, if we just have a moment where we get away, that we're being selfish in one way or another. I mean, the work was there. There was stuff to do. In fact, it even talks about how they were, they had people coming and going all the time to where they barely had time to eat. I mean, why would you stop? Why would you leave? There's too much work to do. But instead, Jesus, being the Son of God and being wise as he is, looks at his disciples and says, we need to go rest. See, sometimes when we desire a life of significance, when we desire to make a difference, when we want to be a part of something big, sometimes when we do that, we overthink our own importance. Do you know what I mean? We overthink just how important we are. Now, this is a humbling thing to realize. So for me, I'll use myself as an example because I'm not really good at this, okay? Can I just be honest with you? I'm not. One of the hardest things for me to do is to take a vacation, okay? Plain and simple. I've made it a requirement of myself because when we first started in ministry, one of the things I wanted to do was take a vacation and be back by Sunday. It's not a vacation. You know why? Because I'm preparing for Sunday all week. So I would go on vacation and be like, well, we got to be back by Saturday so that I can, and I've got, while we're gone, well, you guys can go do this, and I'll sit and I'll prepare my message and I'll do this and all of this. And finally I got to a place and I looked at my board at one point and said, okay, guys, when I take a vacation, you have to require that I'm gone on Sunday. Like, if I'm not gone on Sunday, it doesn't count. Okay? And they were like, well, yeah, no duh. And so one of the scariest things I had to do was go on vacation and not be there on Sunday. Why was that so hard for me? Because I'm a little bit of a control freak. I just am, okay? Ask my wife. I don't let her drive, not because I don't distrust her, but because I like having the steering wheel in my hand and there's no brake pedal on the other side. Don't know what I'm going to do when it's time for kids to drive? I don't know. Yeah, anyway. But one of the best things that I've done and I've had to learn to do, because what I would do is I'd be gone on Sunday and then I would immediately call when I knew church was done. How was it? Everything go okay? And then we started live streaming, which was great because I could be at church without being at church and just watch it and be like, oh, they had problems today, And what's funny is I would be gone, and then I would get braver and be like, you know what, 1 week, maybe I need to be gone 2 weeks in a row and really give my body a chance to rest and relax. And man, that's really hard. But you know what I've discovered? church still happens if I'm gone. You know what else I've discovered? Lives still get changed when I'm gone. You know what else? God shows up. The word gets taught. Lives get changed. Without me. How dare you let that happen? But you know what I discover? While God may use me, He doesn't need me. See, it's really easy for us to overthink our importance and to sit there and say, well, who's going to do this if I don't? How about you let God be God and you be you? See, Jesus, even though there was so much to do, Jesus has his disciples leave. Jesus has them leave. Let's go to a desolate place. And so what do? They get in the boat and they go across the sea to get away from all the people who need them. It's the whole idea when you get on an airplane with your kids and they tell you if the oxygen masks drop down, put the mask on yourself first, which always seems incredibly selfish until you realize that if you can't breathe, you can't help anyone else either. So as a parent, my responsibility is to put the oxygen mask on me so that I can breathe, so that I can then take the oxygen mask and put it on my child. If you want to be called to a life of significance, you must be willing to rest. I heard a story, it was really, really interesting, about Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill is just one of those, he's just one of those larger-than-life characters. Prime Minister of England during World War II. All of these things that he did and was a part of, and the leader that he was. And I started reading a little bit about him, and he would take naps. Like London's being bombed, and he's napping in the afternoon. Not because he was up all night, but because he wanted a sharp mind, and he knew he needed to rest, to have a sharp mind. So he would go and rest. And what we tend to do sometimes is we look at that and we say, well, how selfish. No, how wise. Jesus himself would go away to desolate places and rest. We overthink our own significance, and we have to be careful. See, before they can move on, before the disciples can step into new things, before the disciples can leave or make a bigger difference and be more significant, they had to start with rest. But how many of you know things don't always go as planned? That's what happens here. And then we go to verse 33. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Let's talk about this. This was a great opportunity to be annoyed. You know what I mean? Think about it from the disciples' perspective. We've been out ministering. We've been out doing all of these things. We've been working so hard. We come back to Jesus. We tell him everything, and it says people are coming and going so much that there's barely any time to rest. And so what do? We get in a boat to get away from you people, and you get there before us. Like they show up on the other side in the middle of nowhere expecting to be by themselves, and there's a crowd. We later find out it was about 5,000 men, which means it was probably about 10 to 12,000 people total, waiting for them. So much for vacation, right? Prime opportunity to be annoyed. I mean, perfect chance for Jesus to be like, ha ha, okay, let's go. You know, we need a houseboat. We need something where we can just, in the middle of the lake, stay there. But instead, we get a picture of Jesus' heart. It says that he has compassion on them. He has compassion on them because they're like sheep without a shepherd. They're scattered and they're looking. And Jesus goes ashore and he begins to teach them. See, here's the thing we've got to understand. Okay, Jesus' heart is for people. Plain and simple. But Jesus cares about people. He cares about you. He cares about those sitting around you. And he cares about those people that you don't care about. He cares about people. So much so that Jesus refuses to get annoyed. And instead has compassion on the people in front of him and begins to teach them. If you want to have a life of significance, you need your heart to look more like Jesus' heart. You've got to care about people. Now, that can be incredibly difficult because people are dumb, right? I mean, sounds harsh, but if you don't believe me, we've got some camps that are coming up, kids camp and youth camp, where we take a whole bunch of kids and get them together. And it's not always better with adults. Do you know what I mean? We just have bigger toys and better accidents, but insurance to pay for it. We make mistakes. We do all of these things. We're not always wise. We're not always smart. All these things. People can be frustrating. People have different opinions than you. People can frustrate you. All of these things. Yet if you want to have a heart like Jesus does, you've got to learn to love people like Jesus did. And Jesus shows up on the other side of the sea and has compassion on the people who met him there. And he begins to meet their needs. But that's not where this story stops. This story gets much crazier than this. Verse 37, it says, verse 35, it says, "And when it grew late, the disciples came to him and said, 'This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat.'" See, all of a sudden, the disciples started to recognize the problem. They started to recognize what was going on. They started to recognize a need, a very practical need. See, they were in the middle of nowhere. Remember, they were going on vacation. They were getting away from everybody, and everybody found them. And there's no villages around. There's no big town. There's no market. There's nothing. And the disciples are looking around, and that Jesus has been teaching all day again. And the disciples see a very real problem. The people are hungry. It's late. And they need to go get food. It's a very real issue because if you get that many people sitting around and then they don't eat, have you ever been hangry? Have you ever had 12,000 people who are hangry all at once? That's a bad idea, right? And so the disciples are seeing a very real, very honest issue, and they're saying, "Look, Jesus, you need to send the people away. They need to go find food. They need to go find shelter. We can finish this up later. But you need to send them away." And Jesus offers the invitation in the next passage. He says this, it says, but he answered them, you give them something to eat. Can you imagine that statement right there? 5,000 men, probably 12,000 people. Jesus, you need to send everybody away. They're getting hangry. And Jesus looks at you and says, well, feed them. I love how they respond. And they said to him, shall we go buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? A denarii was about 1 day's wage for an unskilled worker. 1 day's wage. So they're out there and they're like, what, you want us to go spend 200 denarii? We don't have that. Like, what do you want us to do, Jesus? You got to remember, though, these were the guys who just were given authority to cast out demons and to heal the sick, and had just spent time away from Jesus doing what Jesus did. And now Jesus gives them a bigger problem to solve. See, when you desire a life of significance and you're obedient and effective, no matter what you do, no matter what your area of expertise is or anything like that, when you're good at what you do and you serve people and you're making a difference and all of those things, you know what ends up happening? The problems get bigger. They just do. And that's what's going on here. The disciples had been obedient. They had stepped into what Jesus had for them. They had been doing all of these things. And now Jesus is inviting them to the next level to meet greater needs. And the disciples are blinded by their own sight. They're blinded by their sight because all they can see is the problem. All these people standing around, all these people who are hungry, and we're supposed to feed them? It's like, Jesus, we're not in the catering business here. We can't do this. See, the disciples can only see how big the problem is. And I love this because they're looking at him and saying, what do we do? Should we go buy bread? And Jesus responds to him this way. It says this, he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they had found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. So they send them out. Jesus says, well, go see what you have. Go find out what you can collect. Go see what's out there. So they do. They start going around. I can imagine some of the conversations. Yeah, I'm sure there were a lot of conversations not recorded in Scripture where the disciples are looking at each other going, what in the world is he thinking? They got sent on all sorts of little missions and little assignments and things that they were supposed to do, and they thought this is just busy work. This is dumb. It's never going to work. We are not going to find enough food. There's no food truck here, okay? We're not going to find a freezer full of food to feed all these people. It's not going to happen. And yet Jesus sends them out. Go out and find a different solution. See what you have. Now, what's great is this story is recorded in all 4 Gospels. They all remember this instant. I mean, this was a story they probably told time after time after time. And we know from the book of John that they found a boy. They found a boy who had a sack lunch. He had 5 small loaves and 2 fish. That's what they had. And they bring the boy to Jesus. And they bring his sack lunch. And they say, Jesus, this is what we have. This is it. This is what we have. See, what's interesting is sometimes we like to think about and talk about the boy who brought his little lunch, because it wasn't enough. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it was insignificant. It made no difference. And yet, the boy brought it anyway. It would have been easy for the boy to sit there and say, no, I need this for later. I'm getting hungry, right? No, it's not going to make a difference. No, this isn't enough. This is mine. It would have been easy for the disciples to just overlook it. To sit there and say, okay, kid, just go back, find your family, whatever, find your friends, go sit back down. That's not, we got bigger problems than what that can solve. Don't we do that so many times? It would have been easy for them to see it as unimportant, to just overlook it, to move on. But the boy brought what he had. And then you can see what begins to happen. Verse 39 says, then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and fifties. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. He broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. See, one, you can imagine why everybody would remember this miracle. You remember the time that Jesus did math with bread and fish? I mean, multiplication right there. You remember that time where Jesus took a sack lunch and fed 5,000 men? Not only fed them, but we had 12 baskets left over. There was food left. Everybody was satisfied. Remember when God did something incredible among us? See, I want us to look a little bit at this story, because I think there's 2 different sides to this we need to look at. We've talked about the boy who brought what he had. And let me just be really honest. God doesn't expect you to bring any more than you have. And you might sit there and you might say, Chris, you don't understand how little I have. You're right. But God does. And he still invites you to bring what you have. He doesn't expect you to come with more. He doesn't expect you to come with something you don't have. He doesn't expect you to have a skill set that you don't possess. He doesn't expect you to have a knowledge that you haven't gained. He doesn't expect you to be somebody you're not. God knows you. He knows who you are, and he knows what you have. And just like Jesus knew that that boy was out in the crowd with 5 little loaves and 2 fish, Jesus knew that boy was out there. And he was going to work a miracle with what that kid had. Now, in my mind, how I think about all of this, sometimes I sit there and I go, why did he need the bread and fish? Like, if you've read through the Bible, you know that in the book of Exodus, that there was a lot more than 5,000 men. There were 1 million people in the nation of Israel trapped out in the desert with no food. And all of a sudden, God starts having little rice cakes show up every morning. They called it manna, which meant, what is it? Nobody knew. And they got that and they ate it, and then they began to complain because there's no bread. So what happens? All of a sudden, God sends a wind, and thousands upon thousands of quail come. Jesus, why did Jesus need the bread and the fish? He didn't. He could have just snapped his fingers. He was still God in flesh. He was still the Son of the living God. He could have snapped his fingers and everybody got a T-bone. He's God. He'd do what he wants. Why? Why did he need the bread and fish? And to me, it doesn't make logical sense. But I believe that the reason is very, very simply this. Jesus wanted that little boy to be a part of the story. Can you imagine the boy going home? Mom, you're never gonna guess what happened. I bet that kid told that story for the rest of his life. He got to be used by Jesus. It would have totally changed him. Why did Jesus need the bread and fish? He didn't need it, but he wanted to use the boy. So why does God need you? He doesn't. Why does God need me? He doesn't. But he wants us to be a part of the story. I mean, maybe you're here and you're like, but I've got so little to give. That's okay. So did the boy. See, you've got to be willing to bring what you have. Because when you bring what you have, what's incredible is God blesses it and then multiplies it. And it doesn't matter how little you have in this life. It doesn't matter whatever limitation you feel like you have. When you bring it to Jesus, he'll multiply it. There's one other thing I want to talk about. One last piece. I want you to imagine being the disciple who found the little boy with the bread and fish. You see, sometimes God needs you and will multiply what you have. But sometimes God needs you to find someone else that he can multiply also. Sometimes it's not your responsibility to solve the problem. Sometimes it's your responsibility to find the person that God will use to solve the problem. And one of the most dangerous things we can do is to predetermine how God can use someone else. It's easy to look at child, a teenager who's rebellious or rambunctious or a handful or, oh my goodness, let's just pray they don't end up in jail. And to sit there and say, if God ever uses them, it'll be a miracle. Yeah, that's the point. Don't prejudge what God can do through someone else. You be the person who tells them, you've only got 5 loaves and 2 bread? Well, let's see what Jesus will do with it. And then you walk them to Jesus. Don't view any of it as too small or too insignificant to be used by God. I'm going to ask the worship team to come on up. We want to take time and worship, but we also want to remember what Jesus did for us. And so we're going to be taking communion this morning. In fact, if I can have our ushers prepare to pass out communion. One of the wonderful things about God is that He's willing to take whatever you have. He's willing to take whatever pain you have. He's willing to take whatever suffering you have. He's willing to take all of you and multiply it for His kingdom. And just like Jesus dying on a cross, it changed the world. And now we're invited to be a part of that same story. So we're going to take communion here in a minute. You don't have to be a member of the church to take communion. We just ask that you be a follower of Jesus. We're going to take time and we're going to reflect on what He has done. And we're going to reflect on who we are as well as we prepare. So we're going to sing a song, worship together as they begin to pass out those communion elements. And then we will take communion together and remember the body and the blood of Christ together. But let's first take a moment. Let's sing this song together and just acknowledge Jesus' grace.